uh, being here for the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. And if this is your first time, I thank you for being here. And if you're a member, as always, you get it for free as a member of the Friends of the Cabildo. Um, and just a reminder that Thursday we have the history of the Kid Ory House from 1811 with Charlotte Jones that was delayed because they did take on some damage during the hurricane. So in Ida, so I hope that you'll return to us on Thursday. And then next Tuesday we'll get back to our regularly every Tuesday. This is the first one, and we only have one Thursday. On September 28th, we have Deep Delta Justice, a Black teen, his lawyer, and their groundbreaking battle for civil rights in the South with Matthew Van Peter at 6 o'clock. So I hope you take part in that. And if you're a member, you take advantage of that. And if you're not a member, you can just purchase a ticket for $10. Just a quick little housekeeping things. If we love for you to ask questions, but we usually will reserve them till the very end. But I do ask that if you do come up with a question that might be, related to anything that's going on, put it in the chat so you don't forget, so that as we get to the end, I'll be asking the questions of Josh about it as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker tonight is Slate's national editor and a native New Orleanian. He co-hosts the sports podcast Hang Up and Listen, and the author of The Queen, The Forgotten Life Behind an American Myth, which I'm going to link as well in the chat. So if you like Josh's work, here is his book. Josh is the co-host of season 4 of the Slow Burn David Duke podcast. Duke, a white supremacist, became an American political phenomenon in the late 1980s. And Duke rose to power and prestige and prominence, his election to the Louisiana Legislature, and then his campaigns for the U.S. Senate and the governorship was an existential crisis for the state and the nation. Levin explores how a Nazi sympathizer and a former Klansman fashioned himself into a mainstream figure, and why some Louisiana voters came to embrace his message. He will also examine how activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens confronted Duke's candidacy and what it took to stop him. Please welcome Josh Levin.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that introduction, and thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's an honor for me to be invited to take part in this lecture series. And if you are watching this or listening to this, I don't need to tell you that the Cabildo is a great and important institution, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Cabildo is a great and important institution. I remember that when I was growing up, my grandmother, Lillian Wright Levine, talked about the Cabildo with so much reverence. She would always point the building out to me in the quarter whenever we would go when I was a kid. And she knew just a tremendous amount about the history of New Orleans, and she wanted to pass along that knowledge to as many people as possible. Actually, in her later years, she used to stand around in the Garden District and just tell tourists who were wandering past, just tell them about the stuff that they didn't know about the history of the place, which I think they appreciated. And so I wanted to start tonight by talking about her, because her love of history and of Louisiana, it definitely rubbed off on me, but also because her family story, which is really my family story, our family story, is an important part of why I decided to pursue this project on David Duke's political rise in Louisiana. And so let me tell a little bit of that story. Her father, my great-grandfather, Lewis Wright, came to the United States in the early 1900s. He came to the US because he was afraid of the violence and the threats of violence against Jewish people in Eastern Europe. Lewis Wright had a relative in the town of Marksville, Louisiana, and so that's where he went first when he came to the South. And he left Marksville. He didn't love it there. He went to a town in Alabama, then he went to Opelousas, Louisiana, and he eventually settled in the town of Eunice, which is on Louisiana's Cajun Prairie. He opened a dry goods store in Eunice, the Lewis Wright store. He opened that in 1911, and it was open in Eunice for nearly 100 years. There are about 10,000 people in Eunice, Louisiana now. In 1911, when Lewis Wright opened his store, there were closer to about 1,700. And only a handful of those people were, like he was, Jewish. But Lewis and his family, his wife, his children, including my grandmother, they were embraced there. And that embrace, the town, the people, for them, it made Louisiana feel like their home. Now, to be perfectly honest, my grandmother did not love living in a small town. She moved to New Orleans to go to Newcomb. She married my grandfather, and she never left. And so New Orleans is where my dad was born, and it's where I was born in 1980. And New Orleans and Louisiana felt like home to me, just like it had felt like home to my great-grandfather when he came in the early 1900s. New Orleans and Louisiana, that's where my family was. That's where my community was. That's where the Saints and LSU football were. And so where else would I possibly want to be than where I was? And so for me, there's not much that I remember from my childhood that was uncomfortable or scary. But when David Duke came on the scene in the late 80s and early 90s, which was when I was 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, that felt different. I think, I've thought about this a lot in the last couple of years. I think the best word to describe it is maybe destabilizing, because before that, for me, everything had felt pretty stable, pretty predictable, which is partly because of growing up where I did, when I did, with the family I had, partly because of my race and my class and nationality, but also partly because I was a kid and I wasn't that familiar with how the world worked and some of the scarier elements of it. But I did know enough when I was that age, when I was a kid at that time, to know that David Duke didn't like people like me, didn't like Jewish people. I knew that he denied that the Holocaust ever happened. I don't honestly remember how I came to know that. And I have to confess that most of my memories of that time, from when I was a kid, before I really started studying this as an adult, my memories were kind of blurry. Duke won his race for state representative in 1989. He ran for the US Senate in 1990. He ran for governor in 1991. And I can't tell you exactly when during those races I felt the things I felt, but I do remember a couple things really clearly that stuck with me for 30 years. I remember seeing one of those huge blue and white David Duke signs. And if you were around then, you know the signs that I'm talking about, I'm sure. I remember seeing one of those signs on the roof of a restaurant in Bucktown, a restaurant that we would often go to. And I remember feeling pretty freaked out by that. I also remember seeing Duke working the crowd at Tiger Stadium in Baton Rouge. And that scared me even more because the people there at Tiger Stadium, the LSU fans, and I was and remain a huge LSU fan, they really, really seemed to love that guy. A lot of them did, at least. And so when I was, again, 8, 9, 10, 11, as a Jewish kid in Louisiana, I'm taking in all these sights. I'm taking in these messages. And I think naturally start to wonder, what does it mean? Where do I stand? Is this state my home? Could it be my home or my family's home? If someone like David Duke could be so popular, could potentially be so powerful. In 1991, that was really the height of Duke's popularity. He ran for office a bunch of times before that. He ran for office a bunch of times after that, but he never came as close to really taking control of the state as he did in that governor's race. In the 2000s and the 2010s, he became more and more marginalized as a figure, as a person, even as the ideas that he espoused didn't necessarily become marginal. He just as a person was sort of no longer a political player. But even so, I never forgot the feeling that I had during the late 80s and early 90s of wondering where I stood. And the fact that he lost at the ballot box, that didn't erase the feeling, and it didn't necessarily feel like a full repudiation, because when you look back at what happened in those races, Duke won the majority of the white vote in Louisiana when he ran for Senate in 1990. Duke won the majority of the white vote in Louisiana when he ran for governor in 1991. And in 91, 30 years ago, he got a total of 671,009 votes. 671,009. That is a huge number. And no matter how much time passes, no matter what happens, or what has happened in the years, decades that have passed, that number never gets smaller. It's always going to be the same number of people that voted for him and his message and his ideology. And so almost 2 years ago now, I embarked on a project to try to understand how this all happened, not necessarily to understand David Duke himself and who he was. I wasn't all that kind of curious or focused to really get inside his head. I wanted to get inside the heads of the people that were my neighbors, my fellow New Orleanians, Louisianans, and understand, how did a former Klansman and someone who believed in Nazi ideology, how did he come so close to taking control of the state? I wanted to use the tools that I have now as a journalist to look into the questions I didn't know how to answer, or even kind of to think about when I was a kid. And so the result of that work, that project, was published in 2020 with the help of my colleagues at Slate as the 4th season of our podcast series, Slow Burn. Just to give a little background on that, Slow Burn is a show about the most consequential events in modern American history. And it started with a season about Watergate. It was hosted by an incredibly talented colleague of mine, then colleague named Leon Nafok. I helped to edit that season. And then after that, we have done seasons on the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. We did a season on the run-up to the Iraq War, and we're working on a new one now about the Los Angeles riots that's going to come out later this year, and it's going to be really excellent. A bunch of different topics, but no matter what the topic is, we want to give listeners a sense of what it was like to live through those events and how it felt when you don't know what the outcome is going to be and everything feels up for grabs, kind of before history is history. And we do that with the help of archival audio and video, with new interviews with politicians, journalists, activists, ordinary citizens, people who played key roles in all of these events. And it's a scripted series. And what that means is that we take that archival audio video, we take those new interviews and write narration around them that contextualizes that material. And then I add my own thoughts about what I learned, about what I think. And for the David Duke series, the end product is 6 episodes, about 45 minutes each. You can listen to them on Slate or wherever else you get your podcasts if you haven't listened and you're not sick of me after tonight. And if you want even more than that, there's a membership program called Slate Plus. And for members of Slate Plus, we published a bunch of extra material, extended interviews, conversations with me and our producer, Christopher Johnson, about how we made the show. We talked to Topher Grace, who played David Duke in Black Klansman, Spike Lee's movie, for instance. That's one of the extra episodes. But this is not an advertisement, I promise you, just some background. And since all of us here love history, I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about how I did the research for this project. And I'm also going to focus on the people whose voices you hear in the podcast, people that I talk to, people who we were able to use interviews from, who lived through all this, who participated in all this, who are kind of the reason why we know anything that we know about David Duke, and the reason why David Duke ultimately didn't win. And I promise you that these people are a lot more interesting than I am. And so I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about them. So the first audio that you hear in the podcast, if you listen at the beginning of the very first episode, it's from a recording made by a woman named Evelyn Rich. In the 1980s, Evelyn Rich was a graduate student. She was doing her PhD at Boston University, and she was doing it on the modern Ku Klux Klan. So there have been multiple periods of the Klan in American history. There's kind of the Reconstruction era version from after the Civil War. There's the version from the early 20th century that was kind of more of a political group and became hugely powerful and influential. And then there was the version that David Duke kind of revived in the 70s and took from a moribund organization, just kind of a name, like a catchphrase for white supremacy, white nationalism, hatred. And he kind of reinvented it and made himself the face of it. And so Evelyn Rich was, as a grad student, looking into all this, and she interviewed a lot of then current, some former members of the Klan. She talked to people who believed in Nazi ideology, among them David Duke. Now, Evelyn Rich herself was kind of an odd character. I wasn't able to get into her story very much within the podcast, but she is the longtime romantic partner of a man named Jared Taylor, who runs a white nationalist group called American Renaissance. So that's one part of her story. And in these tapes, if you listen to them, the ones that she made for her dissertation, where she's interviewing the Klan members, she really flatters her interview subjects. She tells them all how terribly interesting they all are. And she has said in the past that she liked Duke personally, but she also called him domineering and dictatorial. And the interesting thing, and something that I wasn't necessarily able to get to the bottom of, is that she donated all of her research material to Duke University, which is, as a side note, kind of confusing, the whole David Duke University thing. But she made all of that research material available to researchers, people like me, anyone who's interested in hearing this stuff. And it's that material, it's those interviews that she did that played a huge role in exposing Duke for who he really was, precisely at the moment when he was trying to craft a new image for himself as this kind of Reaganish Republican in the late 80s and early 90s. And so, I'm not sure what Evelyn Rich's motivation was for doing that, whether she actively wanted to take down Duke or whether she just wanted to make that a material available for scholars with no particular agenda. But I'm grateful that that material exists because, to get back to the audio that we played on the podcast, the first interview that you hear is from a conversation that Rich had in 1986. It was at a conference for Holocaust deniers, and she was talking to a neo-Nazi named Joe Fields. And Duke kind of barges into this interview that she's doing with Joe Fields. He comes through the door and he starts talking into Rich's microphone. He wants to be a part of the conversation. And in that conversation on that tape, you can hear David Duke saying that Jews were, quote, trying to exterminate our race. Speaking of white people, he says, in a moral sense, the Jewish people have been a blight who deserve to go into the ash bin of history. He says that he, in the mid-1980s, that he's trying to bring people into his cause like a drummer. And he says that America is ready for a new Führer, a reference to Adolf Hitler. And he says, there are millions of Americans who are alienated and are looking for something. And that, quote, I might have to do it because nobody else might come along. So again, this is in 1986, and it's important to emphasize this was a private recording, that this was, I think he believed he was speaking to a friendly audience, and this was not something for broadcast. The tape wouldn't come out until years later, but this was what David Duke said and what he believed, again, when he was in front of a friendly audience. And I thought it was important to start the podcast right there, to present Duke in this unvarnished way, the way that he presented himself to a friendly audience, rather than the way he presented himself just a few years later when he ran for office, first in 1989, and then again in 1990 and 1991. And so the first episode of our series, it tells the story of how Duke tried to create this new image for himself, and was very successful in doing so, at least initially. In 1989, when he ran for office, when he ran for state rep in Metairies District 81, he did not talk about the Holocaust at all. He presented himself as a mainstream, I guess, conservative Republican. He talked about taxes and how they were too high. He talked about welfare and how too many people were getting it. He talked about affirmative action and how it was unfair. Duke presented himself as somebody whose calling card was that he was honest and that he was outspoken, and that he was honest and outspoken in a way that other politicians were not, that other politicians were kind of, being smooth and fancy and just not being real, and that he was telling the hard truths about America, about Louisiana, that other candidates just didn't have the guts to say out loud. And he presented his ideology, white nationalism, as an ideology that was not, and this was kind of in his words in his presentation, he was arguing that it wasn't anything about being negative towards other people. He was just wanted things to be fair. He said that Black Americans in particular were getting special privileges. That was the affirmative action piece of this, and that was not fair, and that it was about time that someone spoke up for people who weren't getting those special privileges. I mean, it's a kind of a ludicrous idea, but the idea was that someone needed to speak up for white people, because white people were not getting what they deserved, what they should get, and it just wasn't fair. And so during this campaign, Duke's talking about taxes, he's talking about welfare, he's talking about affirmative action. There was reporting about Duke's history in the Klan. His opponent, John Treen, another Republican, circulated a photo and a flyer, campaign literature of Duke as a college student wearing a Nazi uniform. That was out there, that was available for anyone to look at or try to ponder if they wanted to. Duke himself tried to brush that off. He said it was a youthful indiscretion, it was a mistake, it was a joke. He said that all of the attacks on him were unfair character assassination. And so the episode ends, this first episode of the podcast, with Duke's election night party, which takes place in early 1989. And the New Orleans journalist, Jason Berry, was at that party. And Jason is just a tremendous journalist, has done great work on so many different subjects. And he was one of the people who was writing very critically and about Duke at the time, and exposing a lot of the stuff that Duke didn't want to expose. And so he was on the scene that night. And he told me, and you can hear in the podcast, he talks about just the mood at that event, how angry Duke's supporters were at this, what turned into a victory party, because David Duke won by 227 votes. And we have tape from that night. It was recorded by another amazing journalist and historian, Plato Robinson. He was then working as an independent radio journalist, and Plato was circulating among the crowd that night. And you can hear Duke voters telling him that they voted based on economics, that they voted because of taxes, and that it was not because of any racial issue, that race was the furthest thing from their minds. And so whether or not you believe that, and whether or not you believe that the people saying that at the time believed it themselves, what comes through very clearly in those tapes was the tribalism of that party and of that moment. And in his victory speech that night, Duke talked about how he'd been attacked, how he'd been slandered by the media, how he'd been lied about. And like Jason Berry said, it wasn't really a celebratory vibe, even though it was a victory party. The feeling from the stage and from the audience was one of grievance and outrage. And you can hear and feel the crowd in the room bonding over that. And I think that was one of the main sources of Duke's power and appeal in that election and in the years that followed. The sense of shared grievance and shared purpose. And the promise that Duke made was that he was the one who understood that grievance, and also that he could do something about it. The reality was, if you listen to him, his speeches from back then, he doesn't really offer solutions. What he does is point out scapegoats, make scapegoats, and villains, identify villains. And that can be a very powerful thing, this idea that some large group of people has a common enemy. And Duke used that idea to win an election, and that victory gave him legitimacy to some extent. It gave him a platform. He was an elected official, which made it so that you couldn't ignore him. But for Duke, he was not thinking of the state legislature. He was not thinking of that District 81 race as a kind of goal or endpoint. He wanted to be the president of the United States, honestly. Even the governorship was not his end goal. He had run for president even before he ran for the District 81 seat. He ran in 1988 and didn't really get anywhere, but that was his ambition. That's where he thought he belonged. And so to get where he wanted to go, to get an even bigger platform, to get in the Senate, to get in the governor's mansion, to become president, he really did, he needed this first step, and he was successful there, but he also needed to keep his past in the past. He needed to convince as many people as he possibly could, as many voters, that he was a changed man. Or even better, actually, that he had never even done the things that he did to get people to believe that it was all a lie. And so in the next episode of our series, the second episode, we went back to the beginning to show actually who David Duke was, what he did, where he came from, how he emerged as a public figure. This is the past that he had tried to bury. And all that started when he was a student at LSU in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was a place, a physical location at LSU in those days called Free Speech Alley. And what Free Speech Alley was, the name makes it pretty clear, but it was a regular meeting place where anybody could get up and say and argue about anything that they wanted. There were no limits. And a lot of the topics were kind of pretty mundane college stuff, like about, the clothes that people wore and, any the concerns of college students that kind of are not attached to a particular place or time. But people also talked about, the issues of the day, whether it was, Nixon or the Vietnam War. And David Duke was there every week. He would get up on the soapbox at Free Speech Alley, and he would talk about what was on his mind. And what was on his mind then was that white people were mentally superior to Black people. He talked about Jews being traitors. He was seen giving the Nazi salute at LSU in those days. And he wasn't particularly popular, kind of quite the contrary. He would get shouted at and booed. But that actually fortified him in a couple ways. It gave him practice about dealing with a hostile audience, but it also kind of strangely, I think, convinced him that he was right, that the vociferousness, that the level of outrage that he was getting from some quarters, it just kind of steeled his resolve and made him feel even more committed to his cause. We talked to somebody who people who are familiar with LSU basketball might know, or just have been around Louisiana for a while, Collis Temple, who was the first Black basketball player at LSU. And we wanted to feature him because he met David Duke at the time. He witnessed all of this at Free Speech Alley, but also to kind of give a sense of who and what David Duke was arguing against at that time, because Collis was a standout student and a standout athlete, and he had never thought about going to LSU. In his family, he had relatives who were denied admittance and had to go out of state just because of segregation, because LSU didn't admit Black students. And so his entry into LSU was a real kind of landmark moment, an event for the school and for the state. And there were people then and now who are incredibly proud of that and of him, and he's gone on to do great things. But there are also a lot of people who wanted to let him know that he wasn't welcome there, and that Black people were not welcome there. And so just thought it was powerful to put his story alongside Duke's, where Duke is arguing at that time about how white people are put upon. He's arguing at the time about all of the challenges and difficulties that he's facing. When you have the story of this man, Collis Temple, who gets to a school where there aren't that many people like him, where he has to listen to the likes of David Duke, where he says the support system that he had were the people that cleaned the dorm that he lived in, and the people that cooked, some of the few other Black people on campus. And that contrast, I think, is really powerful to me, and demonstrated kind of the reality of a situation that David Duke was trying to obscure. And so this is where David Duke kind of first becomes known. He has a platform, Free Speech Alley. He's a kind of campus celebrity, but he, again, his ambitions are always, very large, and wanting to get to the next place and do the next thing. And he begins to correspond with hate groups, the National Socialist White People's Party, the group that had been known as the American Nazi Party, among them. And he kind of creates a network of people beyond Free Speech Alley, outside of LSU. He makes an alliance with a man named Don Black, who would later become his, one of his main allies in the Klan, who would support Duke in his political campaigns. Don Black would also eventually create Stormfront, which was the largest online gathering place for racists. And Don Black's son, Derek Black, would become his protege and was Duke's godson. And Derek would eventually leave white nationalism. And there's a great book written by Eli Saslow called Rising Out of Hatred that's about Derek Black. And if you're interested in any of these subjects, I would highly recommend reading that. And so Duke is making these connections, and he ultimately decides that he's going to revive the Ku Klux Klan, that's going to be the vehicle for him. And he founds this organization, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And at that moment in the 1970s, the Klan is kind of an empty husk, I would say, and that David Duke sees this as an opportunity, that this symbol of terror, of white supremacy, is really up for grabs, and he assumes the mantle for himself and learns how to portray himself as a new kind of Klansman, a guy in a suit rather than a robe and a hood, although he would wear the robe and the hood on occasion. And so he, again, uses this vehicle to get notoriety and to get media coverage. It's how he becomes a known person in America, is that he gets on talk shows, he gets written about in newspapers as this kind of, not somebody who was necessarily, as far as the mainstream press was concerned, they weren't supporting his ideas, but somebody who they thought was interesting. And by virtue of that, he's able to get this larger vehicle for his ideas, to spread them around the country. And he has this ability, which you can see in his later political career, to go where there's conflict, wherever it is in the country, and to stoke that conflict and to stoke that anger. And he does that in South Boston in the 70s, where there is a huge fight about the desegregation of the schools, about busing. And Duke goes there. And I think even to his surprise, he finds that there's a really huge audience for his message and his ideas in Boston at a time of where there's a lot of anger and resentment, outrage among white people there. And I think, again, Duke finds that fortifying, this idea that there is a big audience out there for him and for his message. And so Duke, he's not just a Klansman, a Klans leader at this point. He does actually run for office in the 70s. He runs for the state legislature in Louisiana in 1975. He gets 33% of the vote in an affluent district. But by the end of the decade, when he runs again in 1979, Duke gets fewer votes than he had in 1975. And so what he realizes then is that the Klan had propelled him to popularity. It had made him famous. It had made him a name, but it was only going to carry him so far, that he needed to shed the what Lance Hill, the historian, called the robe and ritual of the Klan, that he needs to have a, he's a Klansman with a suit, but he needs to shed the Klan entirely. And so he starts this organization called National Association for the Advancement of White People, kind of a ridiculous play on the NAACP. For him, this is a clean slate. It's a group that doesn't have the history of terrorism and violence that the Klan did and does. And he realizes in that moment that he needs to sell what he ends up selling in the late 80s and early 90s, this message that's more of a kind of quote unquote mainstream message about welfare, affirmative action, and taxes. And so I mentioned Lance Hill, and he was a part of this group, the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. And that was the group that did more than any other to remove the varnish from Duke, to present him as he really was. And they actually included, the Louisiana Coalition, some of the excerpts from Evelyn Rich's audio tapes in anti-Duke campaign ads in 1991 that were very effective. The files of the Louisiana Coalition are at the Amistad Research Center, which is the independent archive that's partnered with Tulane. Folks at Amistad are really great and were really helpful with this project. Before the pandemic, in late 2019, early 2020, I spent a lot of time looking through those files. And there's so much amazing stuff in there. The research that the coalition did, the memos they wrote, the material they unearthed that Duke had tried to suppress, all of that was really valuable to me. But I also found it really moving to see all of the work they'd done, and to feel like I was kind of in conversation with these journalists, other people who work on history, to feel like I'm following in their work. I mentioned Lance Hill, I mentioned Jason Berry, Plato Robinson. Larry Powell was another person who was very active in the Louisiana Coalition, a Tulane professor. He also wrote a book about David Duke and about Anne Levy called Troubled Memory. It's just an amazing magisterial work of history. And so just feel like extremely indebted to the people who are writing about Duke and thinking about him long before I did. So I guess I want to end by talking about Anne Levy. I mentioned Larry Powell wrote that biography of her, and she is a Holocaust survivor. She was a child during the Holocaust. And in Poland, the German army invaded Poland in the late 1930s, and her family went into hiding. It's an incredible, remarkable story of survival and ingenuity, and hid the way that she and her sister hid and were hid. It's, we include her testimony in the podcast. It's just deeply moving, and when you hear it, you'll never forget it. And Anne came to New Orleans after the war, after the liberation of the death camps, and she made a life for herself in New Orleans and Louisiana. And in the 80s, lo and behold, there's the rise of David Duke. And after Duke was elected as a state rep in 1989, there was an exhibit at the Capitol put on by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Jewish Human Rights Organization. It was called The Courage to Remember. And that exhibit showed the history of the Holocaust in photographs. It showed everything that Anne Levy had lived through. And for her, this is deeply personal. And so when she sees David Duke at that exhibit, looking at those photos, she asks him, "What are you doing here? Why are you looking at these posters? I thought you said it didn't happen." And he turns around and tells her, "I didn't say it didn't happen. I said it was exaggerated," which is a lie. He did say that it didn't happen. And she starts chasing after him, and Duke just kind of runs away. But Anne Levy would continue to follow Duke, to speak out against him in the years that followed, like Lance Hill did, and a bunch of other people did, that are featured in the podcast. And so it was that story and so many other stories that I think were a lesson to me as I tried to answer the question that I had about Louisiana and who belongs there and whose home it is. That you've got to, if you believe in a place, if you want to be in a place, if you feel like a place is your home, you have to fight for it. And that's what she did. And that's what so many people did, whether they were journalists, whether they were politicians, whether they were people like Anne Levy. And so those are the stories that I tried to tell. And thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks, Josh. That was this story is really, really almost sometimes you have to sit back and kind of think about it, and it blows your mind to an extent that he got as far as he did on in so many areas. So thank you so much for exploring that and talking more about it. We do have a couple of questions. If you don't mind, I'd love to ask you a couple questions.
Please, yeah, thank you.
The first one was, what was David Duke's legislative career in the Louisiana Legislature like?
So he used the legislature as sort of a performance space, okay, rather than as a place to enact policy. He would make speeches and he would fundraise off those speeches. And Larry Powell, who I mentioned, talks about going to the legislature and seeing Duke sitting at his desk with just stacks of envelopes from people that would send him donations from all over the country. And Duke is sitting there with a letter opener, just like slicing. It's kind of like a display of like power on his part of like, look at how much support that I have. And he's like slicing open these letters and money is just falling out over his desk. But the stuff that he's proposing in those days is, he argued for implanting welfare recipients with a Norplant, birth control, just things that are kind of appalling on their face, but kind of send a message to his voters and his constituency about what he stands for and what he believes in. And he didn't succeed in getting anything passed, but he succeeded in carving out a space for himself where he got a lot of attention, where he got a lot of people talking about him and reckoning with him. And the thing that I didn't really get the opportunity to cover tonight, but that we talk about at length in the podcast, is how the state Republican Party kind of reckoned with this, how they reckoned with the fact that Duke was so popular, how they reckoned with the show of force of him opening these letters and having the money fall out. How do you deal with somebody who you might find appalling, but who has a direct line to so many voters, and different people in the party, different people in the state kind of answer that question in different ways.
Great. And if people have, we have a couple other questions that have been put in the chat. If you do have questions, we're going to ask them. And if you'd like to ask them, you're more than welcome to. We have a group enough that it would be fine. So you could put up the little button, you can do a little hand, and I'll let you ask it of Josh. But a couple more questions about Duke. You know, when you were doing the research, I mean, I can almost feel somewhat a little bit of that. It's almost was shocking to you as a Louisianian that, you know, you came from the same place as David Duke is. What did you find that you didn't know about Duke that was so shocking to you as a Louisianian?
I guess the thing that was shocking to me was just kind of coming to grips with the fact that he was such a force. I think even though you can look at the numbers and look at the stats and think about it, but it didn't really hit me viscerally the way that it did until I started hearing about his rallies and the number of people that were there, and also just the fact that it wasn't just people that were maybe less educated, or people that you might, it's not comforting in any sense that anyone would support him or vote for him, but his support was much more widespread across kind of social class. And so I guess that's not really one specific thing.
Oh, that's good.
Just the whole picture, like the more you get the sense of that whole picture, I think in some ways it's shocking, and in other ways it's maybe not, depending on your vantage. But yeah, that's my answer.
Just a couple other things. I did link. I know he said it wasn't promotion, but I still linked Slate Plus in the chat. So if you're interested in that, as well as the Slow Burn podcast. So if this is the first time that you've ever heard it before, or you want to learn more, there's links in both of those, as well as his book as well. I mentioned earlier in the chat as well. So you can link to those. Emily Perkins asked, what was the reaction to this podcast nationally, and did people see it as more as a local story behind a famous name, or did people see it as a microcosm of fascism in the United States, especially during the Trump era?
Thank you for the question, Emily. I think the latter. People, since it came out when Trump was president and during that election cycle, I think a lot of people, I don't know if you know the term subtweet, I think a lot of people saw it as like a massive subtweet of Donald Trump, which it honestly was not. I think there is a moment in the podcast when you hear David Duke say, make America great again. And so I think you'd have to be not paying close attention to not hear that echo. But for me, this is a story about America. It's not a story about Donald Trump. It's a story about a kind of populist rhetoric that has had currency and found, a place throughout American history, before Duke and after Duke. And I mentioned closer to the beginning about how Duke is a marginal figure, but he was in Charlottesville. A lot of white nationalist figures look at him as a hero. And so at a moment in American history when white nationalist ideology feels like it's on the rise and is a danger and a threat, the Duke thing doesn't, I think, feel like a local story or a curiosity or some kind of cul-de-sac. It feels more like a warning or a preview. And so the response nationally was, I think heartening to me that people thought it was a story that needed to be heard. And there was actually a conversation at the time in the late 80s and early 90s about like, oh, is this just like a Louisiana thing? Like, oh, those people in Louisiana, like we can kind of write them off if we're from Illinois or Pennsylvania. And I think there were people at the time who didn't believe that. And I think those people were right, that you can't write off David Duke as a Louisiana phenomenon, although there are some things about it that are very particular. Like the Duke Edwards race, there is a lot of Louisiana going on, like that wouldn't have happened anywhere else in the country. But there was so much about it that didn't have anything to do with Louisiana. And so I think a lot of people knew that then, and I think a lot of people recognize that now.
To piggyback on that question, I do remember Duke being at Charlottesville, and I remember watching a video of him after the Saturday, and I don't think that he had known at the time if there was a death at the time that had happened, but he was really just spewing some just extreme, ridiculous statements about what had happened on that day. But what is Duke doing right now? Do you have any idea? And any reaction from the Duke camp to your work?
Yeah, so another person I should mention is Tyler Bridges, who reported on Duke for the Times-Picayune in just a completely dogged and heroic way in the early 90s, and wrote the definitive biography of David Duke that folks should check out if they're interested in this subject. So just putting in a word for Tyler. He interviewed Duke. This would have been last year, I guess, when Duke got kicked off of YouTube. And so it was around the time that our podcast came out that Duke got deplatformed, where he lost his YouTube account, a lot of his social media accounts. And I don't know if there's any connection between our show and that happening, but Tyler Bridges asked Duke, what do you think about getting deplatformed? Duke wasn't very happy about it, obviously, but he also asked Duke about what he thought about Slower and about the show. And Duke said they hadn't listened to it, and that he said that I was a committed Zionist, I think the quote was, and basically just tried to tar and discredit the show. So that was his response to it. Nothing particularly surprising, but I mentioned the 6 main episodes. I also there's kind of a 7th episode of the show where I explained why I did not interview David Duke. So if folks are interested in an explanation, it was a considered decision. It was not something I just kind of did lightly, and I thought it was worth it. It made sense to explain it to people who were listening, and so I did that. If people are interested in that explanation, it's out there. But so we didn't interview David Duke, but he did tell Tyler what he thought about the show.
Well, that was kind of a medal you got from David Duke that I don't like it, which is a good thing, because that means you probably did a very good job. I
suppose so. And yeah, I mean, he tells everyone who writes the truth about him that it's a lie. So I'm in good company being called a liar by David Duke.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much, Josh. Really, I think we could have gone a couple hours, but now that people have, if you haven't listened to the podcast, we're going to link it tomorrow with the recording. So we'll have that, and I'll link some of the links tonight that I put on the chat as well in the recording that you can listen to for up to 60 days afterwards. So with that, I want to thank Josh Levin so much for talking about this fascinating part of Louisiana history in an area that obviously has more areas that we can discover more of. So I want to thank you so much for presenting tonight for the Friends of the Cabildo, and look forward to seeing everybody on Thursday for the Kid Ory House Museum talk at 6 p.m. So Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. It was great, and I have more notes, so I could have, maybe go through them another time. But no, it was really nice to be here and an honor to be a part of this series. So thanks.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it, and have a good night, everybody.
Thanks.